In February 2023, a discovery inside an abandoned house in Indiana shook an entire community, a heartbreaking truth that exposed the catastrophic failures of those meant to protect children. This is the story of Oakley Snow, a 23-month-old girl with golden hair and blue eyes that lit up whenever she heard music. She was once the small light of a young family. But when police opened the door to that abandoned house, what they saw was an image that could break anyone. The real question isn't just what happened to Oakley, but how so many warning signs were ignored until it was too late. What you're about to hear is not only the story of a child, it is a reflection of systemic gaps, of moments when adults looked away, and of cries for help that went unheard. Be a voice for children, share this story, because awareness can save lives. Before we continue, I want to issue a warning. This story is heavy. We will not include graphic details, but the failures and pain it reveals are things no child should ever endure. And thank you, whether this is your first time here or you've been with us for a long time, your compassion and your willingness to confront these difficult stories are what give meaning to telling them. Together, we remember Oakley, and together, we refuse to let her story be forgotten. On March 10, 2021, in Oklahoma, a baby girl was born. She had soft, golden hair, clear blue eyes, and a smile bright enough to light up any room. Her name was Oakley Snow. From her very first days, Oakley was the source of joy and happiness in a young family. She lived with her mother, Madison Marshall, just in her early 20s, and her little brother, known as CS, who was about 15 months younger. Her father, Zachary Snow, lived in another town, but he remained present in his daughter's life. To those who knew her, Oakley was a sweet and gentle child. She loved watching cartoons. Her eyes would sparkle whenever music played, and she had just begun forming short, clumsy sentences that made everyone laugh. The image most often remembered is that of a toddler running around, clutching her favorite toy, curious to explore the world around her. This was the real Oakley and innocent childhood. Simple, yet full of promise. That should have stretched on for many more years. But that innocence did not last. From a little girl who once looked forward to every meal, Oakley began to change in troubling ways. When certain adults were present, she would suddenly withdraw, sitting still, her tiny hands clenched, her eyes avoiding the spoon in front of her. The food remained untouched, and Oakley would bow her head in silence as if something that once brought joy had turned into unspoken fear. Adults around her noticed these changes, but brushed them aside as nothing more than a picky eater or a stubborn phase. What they didn't ask was the crucial question: why did these behaviors only appear in front of certain people? At just 2.5 years old, Oakley did not have the words to explain. Her only language was her behavior, her physical responses. And when a child suddenly retreats, refusing the routines that once made them happy, it isn't defiance, it's a cry for help. Tragically, that cry went unheard. What's most haunting is that Oakley seemed perfectly comfortable when she was with her mother or little brother, but in the presence of others, she changed completely. If that question why had been asked sooner, this story might have had a different ending. But this was only the first warning sign, and heartbreakingly, it would not be the last. Oakley had begun to withdraw, falling silent in front of a spoonful of food. It was the only way she knew how to say she was afraid. And when no one stopped to listen, that fear only grew. Imagine this: a little girl who once ran around the house now froze whenever a man walked into the room. Her laughter was cut short. Her blue eyes darted away. Her small hands clenched tight. For Oakley, the world was changing. For the adults around her, it was dismissed as something passing. Before going further, I want to pause. This story recounts real events tied to the serious issue of child protection. It is told to raise awareness, not to sensationalize. If this subject is difficult for you, please consider that before continuing. And if content like this matters to you, share it, because knowing how to recognize warning signs can save a child's life. Sometimes, a single moment of attention is enough. The shift in Oakley's home came when Madison Marshall began a relationship with 25-year-old Roan Waters. Recently released from a 4-year prison sentence for burglary. Just months after his release in February 2022, Waters moved in with Madison and her 2 young children. His presence turned what had once been Oakley's refuge into a place of fear. On October 25th, 2022, that fear became reality. According to police reports, Waters struck Oakley after she cried. A minor injury at the corner of her mouth caused her pain she could not describe. When Madison stepped in, she was harmed too, left with visible marks. Police documented the evidence. Those images, a child's injured lip and a mother's marked face, should have been enough to set the protection system in motion. Instead, everything slowed, leaving Oakley to return home with her fear. A mark on the skin may fade, but for a young child, it is a cry for help. No injury should be dismissed, because the body is often the only language a child can use when they cannot speak. And then came the pattern. Oakley appeared again and again with new visible marks on her legs, her arms, even in places not easily hidden. Chad, who lived in the same house, said he saw it repeatedly. KW, Waters' sister, recalled seeing marks running down Oakley's legs, but was brushed aside when she asked. BW, Waters' brother, testified that just a day before the tragedy, he had seen fresh signs himself. These marks were more than injuries. They were Oakley's way of saying, I am not safe. Tragically, those cries went unheard. According to child welfare experts, every such moment is a mandatory reporting point, a time when any adult must act, even if they are uncertain. But no one reported. That silence created a dangerous void around Oakley, leaving her increasingly vulnerable. This is one of the most painful lessons every time a clear warning sign is ignored. Another chance to protect a child slips away. For Oakley, those chances slowly disappeared until there were none left. By early 2023, the roof that once sheltered Oakley was no longer a place of safety. It had turned into a space of instability, where the fear of a 2.5-year-old only grew stronger. When Madison Marshall and Roan Waters took Oakley and her baby brother out of Oklahoma, they ended up in Indiana, staying in a house owned by Waters' mother. Later testimony described it as a drug house, chaotic, volatile, and utterly unfit for children. In that environment, every red flag became impossible to ignore. Oakley, the little girl whose blue eyes once lit up at music, began to shrink inward. She refused to eat in Waters' presence, choosing hunger over his cold stare. For a toddler just learning to speak, that refusal was not defiance. It was the last way she knew how to say, I'm afraid. Meanwhile, Madison, the only parent by her side, knew the truth. In messages to acquaintances, she admitted Waters was violent, yet instead of turning to authorities, she stayed silent. Her fear was real, but so was her silence. And in this context, silence did more than avoid confrontation. It cut off Oakley's last chance at protection. A child cannot call the police. A child cannot seek shelter alone. That responsibility belongs to the adults. And when adults look away, tragedy becomes only a matter of time. Inside that house, 25-year-old Waters turned daily life into a climate of control. Court records describe punishments for the most ordinary behaviors of a toddler spilling food, holding a fork incorrectly, wetting her diaper, or simply crying out of fear. These were not lessons in discipline. They were harsh and damaging responses to normal childhood development. Madison later admitted that Oakley had stopped eating when Waters was near, too frightened of his reaction to take another bite. No child should ever face such a bitter choice. On February 8th, 2023, B.W. Waters' own brother witnessed Oakley's condition firsthand, furious. He confronted Waters, but instead of calling police, he walked away. Personal outrage is no substitute for an official rapport, and once again, Oakley was left in silence. Everything operated like a closed cycle, behavioral warning signs ignored. Repeated harm left unreported. Public mistreatment left unchecked. And the silence of adults sealing every exit. In that cycle, every opportunity to protect Oakley vanished until no opportunities remained. And this is why listening, noticing, and reporting in time matters so deeply. One overlooked sign can mean one lost chance at life. If you are hearing this story now, share it so that more people can learn to recognize the warnings too often dismissed. Your awareness today could be the protection a child needs tomorrow. As we continue uncovering the truth about what happened to Oakley, I want to pause and acknowledge just how difficult this story is to hear. But silence about these realities is exactly what allows them to continue. Share this story not for shock value, but because awareness builds vigilance, and vigilance saves lives. On the morning of February 9th, 2023, the cycle of violence reached a new level, according to court records. Roan Waters forcefully threw Oakley to the floor simply because she cried. The impact left a visible swelling on the right side of her forehead, a mark that anyone could recognize as the aftermath of mistreatment. For a small child, visible injuries like these are not just medical conditions. They are cries for help, written onto the body when words are never enough. Meanwhile, Madison stood inside the very same house, watching her daughter. Her fear of that man was real, but the choice to cover her child's injuries with makeup revealed another truth she chose: silence. That silence was no longer just helplessness. It was a decision. And that decision shifted her from victim to participant in her daughter's tragedy. The painful question here is, can fear ever justify hiding harm? Or did that silence cut off Oakley's last chance at survival? And in that silence, Oakley withdrew further, as if even her small presence had become an irritation in the eyes of the adults around her. By that afternoon, the evidence was clear to others. Makeup could not fully hide the bruise stretching from Oakley's lower lip down to her chin. This was no longer an accident. It was proof of a deliberate pattern. Investigators later called it conscious criminal intent. Waters knew what he was doing was wrong, but chose to continue anyway. The presence of makeup showed more than abuse. It showed a calculated attempt to conceal it. That concealment did not erase the truth. It became proof of guilt evidence that the perpetrator understood his actions were wrong and persisted regardless. And so the cycle repeated. Some neighbors later admitted they had a feeling something wasn't right. They saw the family. They noticed the downcast eyes of the child, but they stopped at suspicion. No calls were made. No reports were filed. That hesitation, the fragile space between suspicion and action, is exactly where children are lost. If you ever find yourself in that position, remember you do not need proof to report concerns of child maltreatment. A call can be made anonymously. Suspicion alone, a feeling. An instinct is enough to open a door to protection. The afternoon of February 9th, 2023. To outsiders, it seemed like any ordinary day. But inside that house, every moment was moving toward tragedy. That afternoon, frustration boiled over. According to court records, Roan Waters grew angry when Oakley could not bounce on a hopper ball, something far beyond the ability of a 23-month-old. In his rage, he threw her to the floor. The impact left significant swelling on the right side of her forehead. An injury anyone could see was serious for a small child. Such marks are not just bruises. They are cries for help etched onto the body when words are never enough. Madison would later recall the moment her daughter gasped for breath. Struggling, her body limp in her arms, panicked. She reached for the phone to call 911, but Waters knocked it from her hand, cutting off the possibility of rescue. In that instant, neglect turned into deliberate cruelty, a conscious decision to close the last chance of saving a child. Later medical findings confirmed the devastating truth with timely care. Oakley might have survived. The window for rescue existed, but it was deliberately shut. Instead of rushing her to a hospital, Waters repeated over and over, I didn't do anything. It's not my fault. These hollow denials, rather than proving innocence, revealed his awareness of guilt. And then, instead of acting to save, he acted to conceal. Waters wrapped Oakley in a pink and black blanket patterned with hearts, a detail in sharp contrast to the harm that had just occurred. Neighbors recalled seeing him carrying the tightly bound bundle, motionless, out to a Dodge Durango. That moment made one truth undeniable: Oakley did not die from illness or accident. She died because of deliberate choices that denied her the final chance at life. And so, the light of Oakley Snow was extinguished not because she could not be saved, but because she was not allowed to be. The investigation following Oakley's death revealed two sides: the determination of law enforcement and the tragic delays that allowed her killer to evade justice for weeks. As early as January 19th, 2023, when the two children were first taken from Oklahoma Oakley and her little brother were entered into the National Missing Children's Database. Yet, it would take weeks before the full, grim picture began to emerge. On March 3rd, 2023, Roan Waters was arrested at a Best Western hotel in Colorado, wanted on a warrant that had been active since the previous November. During interrogation, he admitted to taking Madison's children to Indiana to use drugs. He confessed to abandoning Oakley's baby brother, CS. But when it came to Oakley, he evaded claiming he had simply left her somewhere in Indiana. Technology became the key to breaking his silence. AT&T phone records revealed a series of unusual calls between Waters, his relatives, and associates on February 9th, the day Oakley disappeared. Digital data from phones abandoned in different locations began to piece together a trail of flight and concealment. The turning point came on March 17th, 2023, when Madison was arrested in Bladen County, North Carolina. At first, she remained silent, but once her rights were read, fragments of the truth began to spill out. By April 20th, while being held at Marion County Jail, Madison gave a full confession, and the very next day, she led investigators to an abandoned house in Martinsville, Indiana. What they discovered inside became an image no one could forget. In a worn-out dresser drawer, Oakley's remains were found. The medical examiner noted she was still wearing the same small white and blue socks from that fateful day. Her blonde hair tied neatly, a life cut short, left in silence inside a decaying house, a final, haunting testament to the cruelty she endured. What followed Oakley's death moved from tragedy to the courtroom. Yet for many, no sentence could ever measure up to the loss of a child. On April 26th, 2023, prosecutors charged Roan Waters with the most serious offenses: murder, neglect resulting in death, and child maltreatment. Madison Marshall was charged with neglect resulting in death and aiding a criminal, on paper. This seemed like the path to clear justice. In reality, it was far more complicated. In a plea deal that stirred deep controversy, the murder charge against Waters was dropped. He pled guilty instead to neglect resulting in death and two lesser charges for the public. The idea that a child could be fatally harmed without the perpetrator facing a murder conviction was a shock that felt impossible to reconcile. On June 13th, 2025, Waters was sentenced to 45 years in prison. Madison, who cooperated with investigators, received 25 years on May 1st of the same year. Both sentences carried the possibility of reduction for good behavior, a fact that only fueled public outrage. The sentencing hearing was heavy with emotion. In his victim statement, Oakley's father, Zachary Snow, wrote, "The hardest day. Sitting in front of the two people who killed my daughter without losing control. My heart beats in my eyes." His brief words laid bare the torment of a father forced to seek justice for his daughter through a system that could never return what was most precious. Legal justice may conclude with numbers years on a sentence, but true justice for Oakley can only begin with change when warning signs are no longer ignored, and when another child is spared from walking the same path. The case of Oakley May Snow exposed catastrophic breakdowns in our child protection system. The arrest warrant issued for Rowan Waters in November 2022 on charges of child maltreatment went unserved for months. That delay represented a fundamental collapse in prioritizing child safety. In the critical window between the warrant and Waters' eventual arrest, Oakley endured escalating harm that ended in her death. The interstate flight from Oklahoma to Indiana revealed another gap. When parents with documented histories of abuse take children across state lines, no automatic alert or coordinated response is triggered. Oakley and her brother were entered into the National Missing Children's Database, but this passive listing never translated into an active search warrant that might have saved her life. Equally alarming were the many witnesses who saw unmistakable signs of mistreatment, but never reported them. This failure was not only moral, but systemic. It underscored how poorly the public is educated about mandatory reporting. Every adult who saw marks on Oakley, who witnessed her fear, who noticed her physical decline, each one had both a moral and legal obligation to act. Silence, in this case, was complicity. The impact of Oakley's death reached far beyond the courtroom. In Oklahoma and Indiana, child welfare advocates used her case to push for legislative reform. Proposed changes included a mandatory 24-hour response window for child abuse warrants, automatic federal alerts when at-risk children cross state lines, and harsher penalties for obstructing emergency medical care for minors. The community's response ranged from grief to action. Local organizations launched training programs to help adults recognize and report maltreatment. One group created Oakley's Angels, a volunteer network conducting wellness checks and offering support to families in crisis. The lessons from Oakley's case are painfully clear. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong with a child. Know your local reporting hotline. Understand that reports can be made anonymously. And remember, you don't need proof. Reasonable suspicion is enough. The story of Oakley May Snow forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Protecting children is a collective responsibility. Her death was not just the failure of two individuals, it was a chain of missed opportunities, ignored warnings, and systemic breakdowns that allowed a vulnerable child to slip through every safety net. But from this darkness, we must create light. Everyone who hears Oakley's story, shares it, and learns from it becomes part of her legacy. We cannot bring her back, but we can ensure her death becomes a catalyst for change. Be a voice for children, report concerns today, support child welfare reforms, and never assume someone else will act. Because child maltreatment thrives in silence and isolation. Break that silence. If you suspect a child is being harmed, call your local child protection services. You don't need evidence, you don't need to give your name, you only need to care enough to act. Somewhere right now, another Oakley is waiting for someone to speak up. Will that voice be yours?